Brendan Marks, college basketball writer for The Athletic, joining us on the show. Brendan, it's always great to have you on. How you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
All right, so we talked prior to the start of the season, and you were feeling good about the chances for Syracuse to have a good year coming into the season. I think you picked them to finish 6th in the ACC conference, if I'm not mistaken. Obviously, they have disappointed in that regard. What's been the most disappointing thing about this team from where you sit?
Yeah, it's just further evidence that I don't know a thing. Nobody should ever listen to me. I'm an idiot. All of the above. I think the biggest thing to me is that, you know, as you saw, I think especially in the first month of the season, probably should have beaten Houston out in Vegas. I was there. I was watching that game. Obviously being able to actually beat Tennessee, that was one of the best wins of Red Autry's tenure. The complete inability to sustain momentum, and now obviously things have completely fallen off the wagon. But to me, it was you had the ball rolling downhill. You have talent. You have pieces. I mean, obviously, I know that there's been some injury issues. Donnie Freeman missing as much time as he did was not ideal. But it's the complete inability to muster any sort of momentum. And, unfortunately, I was really wrong because I thought that this was a team with tournament talent. And I think a couple of people have, sort of whispered to me over the last couple of weeks, it might be tournament talent, but it does not appear to be tournament caliber coaching.
Yeah, and along those lines, I know you released a hot seat article on The Athletic yesterday, and Adrian Autry's seat is scorching hot, as the quote was. In your eyes, what has been his biggest weakness, or the biggest weakness during the Coach Autry era through these last 3 seasons?
Yeah, let me preface just by saying that, those hot seat lists, I personally just hate putting them together because you never want to wish that somebody loses their job, obviously. But as it pertains to Syracuse, this is obviously a place with high expectations. And, now going into 5 straight seasons without an NCAA tournament berth, barring, a run in the ACC tournament later this season, not having made it any of his first 3 years in town, the fact that the team continues to get worse, to me, it is the fact that in an era where it has never been easier to rebuild on the fly and to put together a contender in the span of one off season, Syracuse has not only been unable to do that, but it continues to have these inexplicable losses. The Hofstra one, you can say what you want about the officiating. You can't lose that game if you're Syracuse. And as we've seen in a couple of places around the country, we've seen it in Indiana, Virginia last year, the one year that Tony Bennett stepped down, UCLA to a lesser extent. Your brand, your laundry, it means less than it ever has before. And so it's incredibly easy to slip into irrelevance if you don't seize momentum. And Syracuse for the last 3 seasons, unfortunately, has largely failed to do that.
Assuming the SU job opens up, if things continue on this track that they're looking like right now, the Field of 68 put out an anonymous poll, and it had Syracuse as the 6th best job in the conference. Does that feel about right to you?
Yeah, it feels about right. But I think you could honestly probably make the argument it's even a little bit lower now. Obviously at the top you've got Duke and you've got North Carolina, you've got Louisville, 3 teams that not only have the history but have the resources nowadays. To that same extent, I'd look at Virginia, I'd look at NC State. I think both of those are probably better jobs. And then you're sort of talking about, okay, would you rather be at Syracuse, for example, or would you rather be, this is going to sound crazy, would you rather be at a place like SMU, which has, unlimited resources to work with? Those are the sorts of conversations you start getting into. So certainly I think the history there is a huge draw. There are resources at Syracuse in order to put together a team. I will be interested to see if things continue at this current rate, what direction Syracuse goes, what caliber of coach it can land, because, I can tell you from talking to people around the industry, talking to coaching agents and other coaches, this is still a job that a lot of people covet, but certainly it is not seen as one that has as much of a slam dunk as it used to be.
How much does the resources play into a coach's decision?
It could not. I mean, it's top of the list with a bullet, not even close. And, I'll put it to you this way. When opposing coaches have, been hired over the past couple of years at different high major levels, when you call around to get a sense for, okay, how good is this guy? What's his aptitude, et cetera, a lot of times opposing coaches are not as concerned about how good the coach is. Their first question is, well, how much money is he going to have? Because if you don't have the resources, it doesn't matter if you're the best X's and O's guy in America. you're not going to be able to compete with the best of the best. And then you don't have to be, I think this is where people lose the point. You don't have to have the most money. You don't have to have Kentucky's $22 million to build the best roster in college basketball. But you have to be in the ballpark of competitiveness to where if I have this offer and I have a similar offer from your school on the table, I want to go to your school because of the tradition, because of the coaching, because of the development, because of the lifestyle that I'm going to have, because of the tradition of putting guys in the league. You have to put yourself at least in the competitive ballpark to then be able to sort of swing certain players' commitments based on, whatever your school's factors are. But money is the number one factor, and you cannot build a winning program and team without it.
Yeah, we saw that with the SEC last year where they made a concerted effort to make their basketball better, and they did. Now, if Syracuse comes open and, say, an LSU or a South Carolina comes open, can Syracuse compete with them or any SEC school?
Yeah, I certainly think so. And look, there are some people who Syracuse is going to be more attractive than any of those schools. Like, South Carolina, for instance, there isn't a tremendous pedigree of success there from a basketball perspective. LSU obviously had a lot of success under Will Wade, but outside of his tenure, not a ton of success to speak of. So, your long-term infrastructure still matters, and there is still a very invested fan base that supports Syracuse, that wants Syracuse to do well, and that you can sort of culminate that and cultivate it and make it your own. But I will say that, if Syracuse comes open as compared to, you look at some of the other jobs that we had in our list yesterday as compared to, even a Georgia Tech in the ACC. Okay, well, what are the resources? What's the difference? How about versus a school that's in the Big 12, a school that's in a Big 10, Ohio State, if that comes open? It's all about what resources you're going to have at your disposal as a coach. Again, the fact of the matter is, if a starting caliber player costs 7 figures and you barely have 7 figures, you're probably not going to be able to put together a winning team.
Along those lines, Jim Boeheim has said in the past, when you take into account NIL and the rev share, that he estimated about $10 million is needed to put together a roster that could contend in the ACC. Do you think that's about right? Is that a fair number? And where do you think Syracuse kind of falls in the pecking order there in the conference?
Yeah, I can tell you guys for a fact that there are multiple ACC schools this year that are over the $10 million mark, and you can probably guess which ones that is. There are multiple that are over the $15 million mark. Now, that's when we're talking – once you get past $15 million, that's when we're talking about, okay, you're probably in the top 10, 15 spenders in the entire sport. I think 10 is still – 10 is what I would say is on the upper band of acceptable. 8 to 10 is about what it's going to cost right now to put together a team that is capable of getting to the NCAA tournament. And, that is – you can do that different ways. For example, let's say you have a Cameron Boozer, an AJ DeBonsa, JT Toppin, one of these truly dynamic all-star, all-American caliber players. Those guys in and of themselves are going to cost multiple millions of dollars. And so you can take them, but if you're doing that, you then have to moneyball the rest of your roster. Versus if you want to, spend $1.5 million each on your starting 5, then fill out the rest of your bench with guys who are making, just six figures instead of 7. You can do it that way too. So, but I would say, there are teams that have been successful this season that are under that $8 million mark. But that's what I would kind of consider the low end of, what is kind of conventionally acceptable to prove that you're investing at a real level in college basketball today.
All right. I know you probably can't give real numbers, and we've been fighting about this over and over this week. Where do you think Syracuse falls in the ACC in NIL?
Definitely in the top half still. So that's the thing. So you're not going to be in that top 2 or 3. That's a pretty exclusive club. You're not even necessarily in that sort of next tier of the 10 to 12-ish. And quite frankly, what you've seen more recently, right? Like last year, the ACC did not invest to this level. That's why you had the turnover that you had, and that's why you're now having the success you have, because a lot of the schools that brought in new coaches did invest at a much greater extent. But Syracuse is in the top half. They are not in the bottom, 2 or 3 or 3rd, because, trust me, there are some ACC schools that are definitely not investing. They're probably right on the fringe of being in sort of that competitive landscape, and every coach will tell you that we need more and we need more. But, I look at Syracuse's roster, and again, there was a reason I picked them 6th in the preseason. I thought the pieces made sense. Thought the fit together was natural. Obviously, some of the transfers haven't materialized or taken quite the way I would have expected. Again, Donnie Freeman's injury. But, like, this is not a team that had no money whatsoever. Let me be clear. This is not a team that was scraping together nickels to try and buy, its six-man. This is a team that had the resources to put together what it hoped would be a tournament roster.
And now let me ask you this. You brought it up a little while ago about the roster build. Do you prefer the way like Miami did it, where they spent on 3 Power 4 guys that started at other schools, or the way Syracuse did it, where they were basically going on potential and spent on the one big guy and kept their 2 guys?
Yeah, I kind of think that every team needs a star. Stars win. Stars win in college basketball. I mean, I'm based here in Durham of North Carolina. So, this year especially, I've seen up close and personal Cameron Boozer and Caleb Wilson, how many times they have single-handedly almost willed Duke and North Carolina respectively to wins. So I don't think that it's necessarily a bad fallacy to do that. You just have to make sure that the guy that you're spending that money on is the type of guy who can do that. And so, it's a situation where you can afford to do that. But the most important guys are the ones who you can get for what I would say is a market rate or a below market rate, where it's, hey, this guy is, we think he's going to be X. He might be worth this. We're getting him for 10% less than that. And then he ends up being an all-ACC caliber performer. But, like all of this Moneyball talk, all of the roster building strategies and philosophies, as it pertains to Red Autry, as it pertains to coaches in general, none of these guys were taught how to manage a salary cap or a payroll. These guys were taught how to coach basketball. And so I hear that refrain from coaches a lot. They're frustrated because, this is not something that any of them were taught to do, not something that any of them necessarily desired doing. That's why you do see so many schools bring in GMs to help manage it. But that piece of it and how you allocate your funds is evolving on a year-to-year basis across the sport.
Brennan, in terms of potential candidates, should Syracuse decide to make a move here and move on from Adrian Autry? Josh Schertz is obviously the hot name out there. So kind of a two-part question. Would they have any shot with somebody like a Josh Schertz? And if not, if he's going elsewhere, who are some of the top candidates that would come to your mind that might be a good fit for Syracuse?
Yeah, Josh is terrific. He certainly is going to be at the top of a lot of different wish lists. And I would think that Syracuse would be in the mix there. I can't see why he wouldn't. He's a guy who has an appreciation for that sort of thing, for history, for what a program has accomplished. So I think that Syracuse would at least be able to get him in the door and have conversations. Whether or not they can, actually land him, again, it's going to come back to, okay, what's the level of investment? And to land a coach who's going to be as sought after as Josh Schertz is, it might be a situation kind of like what we saw at NC State with Will Wade last year, where the coach has the power and says, look, I'll come, but this is going to be the bare minimum of what it takes for me to sign on the dotted line. In that case, if I'm Syracuse and I can by any means make that work, Josh Schertz is the kind of coach who's worth upping the level of investment. Beyond that, you start looking across the landscape. You start looking and seeing what are some of the other mid-major guys who are really promising. I look at like a Brian Hodgson down in Florida. I look at a Tony Skinn in the Atlantic 10, a George Mason, who's, I think he's going to be somebody who had some opportunities last year, is going to have some more opportunities this coming year. Potentially an Eric Olin. He's more of a West Coast guy, but at New Mexico. And then it's interesting to see, are there any NBA guys who want to come back? That's obviously been one of the big trends in college basketball hiring the last few years. Is there anybody with Syracuse ties who would potentially be interested in coming down from the NBA level and coming back to help their former program? So obviously the program has done that with its general manager and Alex Klein and luring him away from the NBA where he was a longtime scout. But we've seen that in coaching too. So there's going to be a lot of different options. The job is obviously going to be coveted, but Josh Schertz, you're right, is going to be right at the top of that list.
There's a certain portion of the fan base that is vehemently against bringing in another Boeheim disciple, and you just mentioned the NBA. Would you be, what are your takes on maybe a Hop or a GMAC coming back to Syracuse?
Yeah, I would say that I want a coach who has a history of success. And if that person is has Syracuse ties, if they're a Boeheim disciple, great. But I say this as someone who has seen succession plans nearby go multiple different ways, right? We've seen how this one has gone with Red Autry. We saw how one, went at Villanova with Kyle Neptune. Obviously, he's no longer there, didn't make the tournament in 3 years. I think there's a lot of similarities between him and Red's tenures. But then, like here at North Carolina, and where Duke and North Carolina are, Duke has been incredibly successful hiring a Mike Krzyzewski disciple and by empowering him and giving him all the tools that he needs to be successful. Hubert Davis has had an up and down tenure. You know, he's very criticized here in the state, but he has won the ACC, been a 1 seed, been to a national championship, produced a player of the year. You know, he's done a lot of things that a lot of coaches would kill to do. So I am not just flatly against it, but you cannot have that be the determining criteria. It has to be a it has to be a merit-based hire. You need to hire the person who you believe is going to do the best job, because quite frankly, if you are in Syracuse's position, you are one bad coaching hire away at this point from fading further into irrelevance. And a program like that cannot afford for that to happen. And so, again, if the person who's most qualified does have ties, terrific. But you have to pick the person you think is going to be able to compete with Duke and Louisville and North Carolina and Virginia and NC State on a year-to-year basis, because that's the only thing that matters as far as keeping Syracuse relevant, not whether or not somebody has ties to Bayheim.
Brendan, we're running short on time here, so 2 quick hitters to close you out. North Carolina and Duke are both on SU schedule next week. First things first with North Carolina, we saw the Caleb Wilson news. Do you have a quick update, any sort of timetable or timeline on how long you expect him to be out for?
Yeah, there's nothing yet from the university or the program specifically, but it's hard to imagine that he's going to be ready to play again for the rest of the regular season, which, again, you mentioned Syracuse next week. I'd be shocked if he plays. Obviously, in that game, it seems basically impossible. I think there's an outside chance that he could maybe be back for the end of the regular season. North Carolina closes at Duke on March 7th. You know, maybe the ACC tournament the week after that. NCAA tournament, I think, is where we really start looking at more likely returns. It would have been 4 or 5 weeks at that point for a broken hand. That's typically about the amount of time. The fact that it's his non-shooting hand helps, but obviously it completely changes North Carolina's trajectory without its best player.
And then last one with Duke. They're obviously very, very good. You know, you've been down there covering them for a while. Where does this Duke team, how does this Duke team kind of compare to some of the other really good Duke teams that you've seen lately down there?
Yeah, it's not as good as last year's team, which was like a Death Star on a basketball court. I still think I was joking with some buddies the other day. Remember when Cooper Flagg missed the ACC tournament and, you know, the NBA's best three-point shooter was just waiting in the wings to take over at 25. I mean, what a luxury that is. So they're not as good as that team, obviously, but no, they're capable of making another Final Four. Cam Boozer is as productive and well-rounded a player as I've seen in the college game in a couple of years. I don't think that they have the shooting they have, but it's a team that, you know, I put it right up there with, you know, other than last year, probably in that second tier with Coach K's last team and some of the other greats that I've covered here.
Brendan, great stuff as always. We love having you on. Thank you for the insight, and hopefully we can have you on again. Tournament time or so. We love your insight.
Absolutely, I appreciate you guys having me. Thanks so much.
All right, Brendan Marks, college basketball writer for The Athletic. We'll hit a timeout here. We'll check in on the market. We'll get to hour number 2. You're listening to Orange Nation on ESPN Radio.